Good evening and welcome subscribers of this channel, as well as our guests. This podcast is the first of a series of discussions on important issues of the day. I am your host, Ron Hesketh. This episode discusses pre, during, and post-pandemic issues from a health perspective, political decision-making perspective, and the social aspect. I will now ask our four panelists to introduce themselves. Brent?
Hey, Ron, Brent Pattison, resident of Guelph, Ontario, and more than willing participant to join you in your discussion this evening.
Thank you. Ray Lynn?
Good evening, Ron. Raylyn Douglas. I also live in Guelph. I'm a management consultant focusing in the healthcare space. Worked in the Ministry of Finance for about 23 years. And here I'm working to help organizations improve the employee experience and bring more joy to work.
Thank you, Raylyn. Hal Bond, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Was that pause? There we go. Good evening, Ron. My name is Hal Bond. I'm a chess professional. I teach chess to children and I organize tournaments. I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight.
Excellent. And our fourth esteemed panelist tonight is Stephanie Lamb.
Good evening, Ron. Thanks for inviting me tonight. My name is Stephanie Lamb. I'm a postdoctoral researcher working for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, specializing in meat science.
Terrific, thank you. Just a few preliminaries. Our panelists have been given in advance an outline of the course for this discussion and sufficient time to do some research. Topics have been suggested by a survey I conducted last month, and panelists have been asked to support their position with credible sources when and if possible. Each participant will be given up to 2 minutes to express their opinions on each issue. And after the four panelists have answered a particular question, if any of them want to add another comment or respond to another panelist's input, I will give them a minute to do so. Let us proceed. Our first question: how have each of you, your family and friends, been directly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic? We'll start with Stephanie.
Sure, thanks, Ron. That's a great question. As a graduate student, I had just finished my program when the restrictions came about, but I was lucky to be one of the students that finished their programs in a normal way. And shortly after I moved to Alberta for work, unfortunately for my other classmates, they had to finish their programs online, virtually, presenting their 4-year program virtually, which wasn't quite the best way to celebrate the end of a really long program. So that took a toll on them. And for me, although I was lucky to finish my program, I was very far from home and really stressed about if something might happen to my family and I'd be very far away. So that affected me in a negative way. I do find myself very resilient and positive, so I tried to take it as an opportunity to keep working on myself and keep working at my job out in Alberta alone in my apartment. But things have been starting to get better, so I'd say it's affected me in a positive and negative way.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hal, any ideas, please?
Thank you, Ron. I would say the impact has been, overall, it's been negative on our family, as I think it has been with most people. The strongest negative is the lack of socialization. The upside is we've learned a little bit about Zoom, and that's been a wonderful skill to develop and acquire, and one that we'll continue to use. But I think the isolation, although I fully understand its necessity, it takes its toll, and that's all there is to it.
Okay, Brent, your thoughts?
To pick a word, inconvenienced. You know, my family, my friends, perfectly healthy. No one's been affected by it in a health impacting way, which of course is a positive, I suppose. The reality is that we're just inconvenienced, You know, as somebody who used to travel as part of my job that would allow me to travel 2 to 3 times a week to different places around the globe. That's been more than a year since I've been on an airplane, which is a major change to my lifestyle and that same opportunity to explore and see different things and meet new and interesting people. The other thing that I'd say from a negative standpoint is, and I know we're in a podcast talking about this as the primary subject of your podcast, but honestly, I'm sick of the conversation. I'm sick of the fact that every single conversation I have with anybody, anywhere about anything, if we're talking for more than 5 minutes, at some point in time, the topic of conversation becomes the impacts of the COVID experience and the pandemic, like as far as quarantines, pandemic, what vaccine you're going to take. I just don't want to talk about it anymore. That's really the reality. I prefer to be talking about positive things. I will say that there are some positive benefits that I can take away from it. My lawn is free of weeds. My garden is free of weeds. I'm getting much better at driveway basketball from playing with my son. And I think I've now every day setting a new daily record for the amount of time spent on Zoom. But those positives don't outweigh the general inconveniences or just the plain fact that I'm kind of sick of the conversation.
Thank you, Brent. Does that mean you're not going to answer any further questions in this podcast?
Well, I agreed to talk about it. So I'm going to try to set it. This is hopefully the last time I'm going to be actually actively participating voluntarily in a conversation about COVID and our responses to it.
And hopefully the last time we have to talk about it.
Hopefully.
Let's turn to Raylyn.
Well, sorry to belabor the conversation, Brent, at your inconvenience. I would say our experience has been mixed. Thankfully, everyone's healthy and happy, and I've had an extra chapter with my oldest daughter who moved back home. So I'm trying to see the bright side on most of our experiences. My job was impacted last February. It was eliminated due to COVID, but it gave me an opportunity to finish my MBA program in the traditional manner, just like you, Stephanie, before everything went online. And then I made the decision to open up my own consulting practice. And so I've spent the whole year learning, having coaches, writing, working a lot on self, as well as spending a lot of time with my close family. Obviously miss our relatives in Saskatchewan and Western Canada, but really feeling very grateful that we've had fairly positive working from home experience and not too much interruption to our lives.
Thank you. I certainly think that the experiences we're having really depends on our situation, doesn't it? I sympathize with the healthcare workers. Their experience is much different than any of us. I sympathize with people that have had COVID-19 and survived it. And I sympathize with those families where a family member, a cherished family member, has died from COVID-19. So depending on your position in life, your reactions to this pandemic are dramatically different. Question number 2. There have been many complaints over the past year and a half that the information communicated by our provincial and federal governments have been confusing and sometimes inaccurate. I would refer to one point in the Ontario Premier Doug Ford's speech when he was talking on television in response to complaints about miscommunication. And his response was, it's really simple, stay home. He really didn't have an answer to that question as to why his government's message wasn't getting across to a mass of the audience. So my question really is, would you agree that the communications from our authorities, health experts, et cetera, has been somewhat confusing? And if so, how could they improve that? Let's go to Brent for the first answer.
I think the confusion probably actually happens. I honestly, we can debate the level or the decisions that have been made as a result of influencers. The communications, I thought, have been very regular, relatively informative, and probably as accurate as the information available to them can be. And I think that they've made a strong effort of communicating regularly in a routine fashion, on TV, on Twitter, and keeping their government websites updated with information. The part that I think that creates the noise is in our overly connected world of social media, it's the person with the most Twitter followers that really has a voice. And because everyone has a voice, everyone wants to engage in the conversation, share their opinions, and create, as a result of this group dynamic conversation happening all the time across the world in a global forum, it creates confusion. It creates a means by which information can be misinterpreted. And there is no real single voice of authority for every, every time a doctor with real authority and understanding of an epidemic like this speaks, somebody's able to find a different doctor that has a different opinion. And it's that everyone has a voice that creates the confusion, that creates the opportunity for potentially misinformation or the perception of misinformation on the part of what's being provided by the government. If I was to make a critique about the government's communication, though, their website's completely outdated. It's not been modernized in a way to make the information easily accessible, viewable, and searchable in a contemporary format. And if they had just hired the right redesign to really make sure that that was the single source of truth of the current policy and what to expect, and made it really easy for the general population to understand, I think that would add a little bit of clarity around the confusion about what's being communicated. But again, it's not so much that the government hasn't done a good job. I think they've done as well as can, given the environment that they're in, where everything they say is constantly contradicted by the loud voices available in social media.
Thank you, Brent. You're going to put some pressure on our other participants tonight because you covered a wide range there. Stephanie, your turn.
Sure. I think Brent made really great points. I do agree there is a lot of miscommunication and maybe too many voices. And I see that in my own community as well. We have professors that are immunologists for decades, and we see them in the news saying that they're anti-vax or they're for vax. And we also see them arguing with each other on Facebook saying we should implement this and we shouldn't implement that. And as a student, I would think, wow, why are these two really experienced immunologists arguing with each other? And it's often the fact that it's a very unprecedented situation and we're not sure. So that has caused a lot of noise.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree with all of your comments. Ray Lynn, what would you like to add?
Excellent points, both Brent and Stephanie. I agree with you. I think some of the examples that stood out for me in the beginning was sort of the continuous focus on, cough into your elbow, stay physically distanced. And I was wanting more. I was really wanting a little bit more substance to say, well, what if I do get COVID? What do I do? Do I take Tylenol or Advil? Like, I was looking for really practical information. And I agree, Brent talked about everyone having a voice. There's so many platforms. There's so many ways to communicate. I think we live in a society that demands, instant information that has to be accurate and up to date 24/7 around the clock. So we have a very sophisticated society who is willing to challenge evidence and question, which I think is good, but it makes it particularly difficult for the leaders to say, we are confident about this decision. I think one of the more recent examples was the AstraZeneca vaccine. We received it a few weeks ago, saying everything's fine, the risk of clots is very low, go ahead and get it. And then to have the announcement that the government's pulling back on it creates some panic and confusion in the system. So I think, if we feel confident enough to make a statement, we have to stick with it and not be worried about political ramifications or whatever the case may be. And I think one thing I would like to suggest as change in communication is our opposition parties to really sort of tamper some of the negative opposition right now, because it's really a difficult place to be leading. And to stand in criticism and judgment of an organization like the government just seems self-serving at this point in time. So, I mean, that's a system we live in, and opposition parties serve a purpose. But I find that we just need to, find that common voice and collaborate so we're not inciting panic and fear in the population.
Thank you, Raylan. I know on your last point there, what I find most annoying for me is that opposition parties, you're right, they do have a very significant, important role. However, for a great deal of the events that they talk at, they do criticize heavily the federal provincial governments, but are really short on giving alternatives. I would want them to say, well, I think the government's doing it all wrong. This is what we should be doing. If I was in office, this is what I would do. Hal, you get the tough spot at number 4 this turn. Further thoughts from you, sir?
Yes, well, some great points raised across the board. I agree with all of them. I think for starters, for me, I found the biggest challenge was the big voice from the South that was telling us, there is no such thing. And this is, and it was trivialized. The whole procedure with masks took a while for them to even understand because there's this huge learning curve. And everybody is scrambling to try to understand what this is. And as we search for this overarching universal truth, like you say, there are billions of voices with their own opinion. And what do you do when experts disagree? You sit there and say, okay, well, which one of you guys is right? How do we assess our brain trust when there's no concurrence there? I think generally the message that that I've sensed from Canada and from Ontario, I'm with Brent. I think it's been reasonable. There's been plenty they could do better, but we don't see the same. At least I haven't sensed the same amount of partisan bickering in Canada as we have seen elsewhere. But we have, looking all over the globe, there are serious issues everywhere. Every federal government has struggled to deal with this because they all have their own unique situations with travel within their country and all of these things affect the vectors and how the virus spreads. There's been some crazy curves. If you look at rates of infection and improvement, there doesn't seem to be any uniformity. It has wobbled throughout the world. India, of course, being the hot topic now after months of almost smug superiority that they had it licked. So I think that the bad example from the South where they're poo-pooing the whole pandemic was a big problem. We were better than that in Canada. And of course, the situation being dynamic with a learning curve that continues now, especially with variants coming out and what are their properties, what are they going to do? It seems the closer we get to strangling this, the more difficult it becomes. It's like a hydra almost. And so that's it for me. It's a lot to cover, and we have 1,000 reasons to be confused.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And I believe that one of the main issues in this regards is that if you look at all the countries of the world, there really aren't any that have a fail-proof plan. Everybody is struggling with this around the world. Some are doing a little bit better than others, but as far as I know, nobody has the surefire plan to eradicate this quickly. It all boils down to general guidelines. Third question for tonight is one that was suggested by 5 or 6 people that I asked for input. And I find it a particularly interesting one. It has been suggested by some that politicians have conflicting goals with dealing with health issues, such as budgets, partisanship, subject to the demands of special interest groups, and the ever-ready need to be reelected. Do you think the roles should change, such as health professionals and scientists, in the case of a pandemic, make all the decisions, and the governments take a secondary role and be responsible for implementing, financing, and enforcing only? Raylan, you're first up.
Well, I have a bit of a point of view on this, having worked in the Ministry of Finance for 23 years and really gained an appreciation for how government works. It's a very complicated set of restrictions that governments work within. And I think, their largest challenge is balancing priorities, trying to figure out how much do you spend on health, how much on education, highways, social services. So choosing how to spend taxpayers' money is a very large responsibility. But I think it comes in hand with, you make the decisions, you also have the tax levers, the revenue generation opportunities, and you have to balance all those priorities, also thinking about being reelected because you are ultimately accountable to the taxpayer for those decisions. If you said, okay, scientists and healthcare leaders, you're a CEO of a hospital, how should we, spend our money? There would definitely be more money being spent on the healthcare system. And I think we are spending an awful lot more. Typically 50% of budgets are spent on healthcare, and I'm sure that number's gone even larger now. So I think, having responsibility for the taxation and the enforcement and the decision making, those things go hand in hand. And I think we can all agree that there's just not enough money to go around. And we can all agree that we don't want to pay any more taxes. So it is a very delicate balance that governments need to achieve. But coming back to our comment earlier about opposition parties, I think that's where I would like to see some refinement to the roles of government. To, as you said, Ron, come forward with some real strong solutions for us. Don't just stand back in judgment. Don't be a critic. Be a partner in this. We need a little bit more collaboration at this point in time. And speaking of collaboration, I think the other thing that we've really noticed is, scientists around the world are collaborating. They're coming forward with data and science, and they're finding solutions very quickly to, the vaccine and everything else. And we see healthcare leaders standing at the podium alongside the premier and the mayor, or whoever the political representative is. So I think government is really taking the advice of science and healthcare leaders seriously, and they're part of forming those decisions, even if they're not ultimately responsible for them.
Thank you. Well said. Hal, would you like to chip in here with on this particular question?
Sure, Ron. Yeah, so the MPs versus the MDs, perhaps we could say. This is a tough one. I believe in science, but I also believe in democracy. And in the case of a pandemic like this, where the trouble is acute, I think the role of science has to be higher, and their authority, their teeth have to be more in place. Generally, the more general you get into health programs or healthcare policy, I think then that there's enough sort of slippage or enough interpretation that we do need the democratic underpinning to make things work. So I would sort of graduate it. The more serious it gets, the more closely we have to enlist the help of our scientists and heed their words.
Thank you.
So that's it.
We'll now move on to Stephanie. Would you like
Thanks,
to
Ron.
add or further illuminate?
Sure. Well, I think the comments were well said. I absolutely agree. As a scientist myself, I absolutely believe in science, but also I don't know anything about politics or the political system or economics. So I would hope that as a citizen electing someone, I hope I can trust and believe in them to make the right decision, even though we see that's not the case a lot of the time. But I want to trust someone that knows the system to make those choices.
Thank you. And finally, Brent gets the last word on this particular issue.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to offer a conflicting opinion, but Ray and Hal pretty much covered it, and Stephanie reinforced it. As a scientist, she basically proved the fundamental point. She's a scientist, and it's not her job to balance all of those things, which is the job of politics. That's why governing is hard, right? That's why they're held accountable in elections, to make those balanced decisions that, let's face it, scientists are meant to science. And yes, we should listen to their opinion, just like we need to listen to the opinion of economists and other scientists, not just people in charge of epidemic, but also other scientists like psychologists and the impacts and educators, and they take that, all of those balanced opinions, which really is the job of a governing body that's elected, is to weigh all of that in a balanced way to make the most informed decision based on all of the available information that they have.
Thank you, Brent. All really good perspectives on this particular issue. I think we have time, like any broadcasting network, we have a limited amount of time in a program. I think we have time for 2 more questions. This one will be a yes or no answer, if you could. Many restrictions have been put in place by governing bodies: mass, isolation, closing down of businesses. Considering that many people all around the world have ignored these restrictions, do you believe that stronger enforcement measures should ever be taken? Should we call in the armed forces to make sure the law of the land is enforced? Ontario Provincial Police have made a decision that they are not going to stop people at random. And as a side question, if you want to answer it, at what point do you believe restrictions breach the Canadian Constitution of Rights and Freedoms? So a yes or no, and you can comment on the second part of the question if you wish to. Stephanie.
Okay, I think we do not, I may have an uneducated, uninformed answer, but I think we don't need the extra reinforcements unless things get violent or unsafe. I think we should trust the society to follow the regulations, although I do not agree with all of them or how strict they are. For example, closing certain businesses without the statistics that or research that they are hotspots or that we are seeing high infection rates in them. For example, small local businesses, it hurts me to see them close, and we're able to see these other big box stores open. And sorry, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Yes. Do you believe that taking further action at some point breaches our Canadian Constitutions of Rights and Freedoms? Basically, that was the basis that the Ontario Police said, that they were not going to enforce random stops.
Right. Okay. Yes, I think it doesn't breach our freedoms as long as we're doing it out of the safety of the population. And in this case, it's for our health. So I think in that case, it doesn't breach our freedoms.
I think back to when there's a world war and there was conscription to, that would definitely could be considered a definition of breaching the rights of freedoms. But whether this issue comes into that realm, I'm not really sure. Brent, your thoughts?
No, please do not call in the army. Don't.
Okay.
I think we're good. As far as the second question, I can't honestly, I'm not an expert on the actual Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If I was just to throw one on there, as far as the golfers Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I really want to be able to golf. I really want to be able to golf, and I think I should be able to. Over to you, Ron.
That's been an issue with me too, Brent. I was thinking, close the clubhouses so you can't have a party. Golfers generally stay far apart anyway because they all hit their balls in different directions, or you can discipline yourself to do so. And I would think the chance of getting COVID on a golf course is next to zero. So
far it has been zero.
Yeah, that's exactly my point, right? Okay, Hal.
There we go. I'm with Ron. I don't think, or sorry, I'm with Brent on this, Ron. I don't think we need the army, but at the same time, I have very little sympathy for anti-maskers or people who aren't going to get with the program. And so, as far as civil rights and freedoms, as far as I'm concerned, this is about as close to war as armed conflict gets. This is a war against a virus that's infecting the whole world. So as Stephanie had mentioned, in the interest of public safety, you sacrifice your rights and freedoms. You got to take one for the team. So I have almost no sympathy for the for libertarians or whatever stripe of people who say that I shouldn't have to wear a mask because I have the right not to. I'm reminded of the seatbelt. When the seatbelt law first came in, so many people were freaking out about their rights being compromised and so on. And And the government just held their ground, and rightly so. You're going to wear the seatbelt because it saves lives. And if you don't, we're going to fine you every time we catch you. And I don't know what the equivalent prescription would be in this scenario, but I believe that the rights have to take a back seat to the public safety. And that's
Thank you, Al. On that comment about seatbelts, I recall that my mother worked for a company that tested seatbelts, and that research led to the mandating of seatbelts. And at the same time, I had a sister-in-law that was totally against seatbelts, not because it didn't make sense, but because it breached her right for freedom to make a choice. Interesting. Raylene, you're the last one to chip in on this question.
That's an interesting analogy and a very good point, Hal. The seatbelt, I guess the equivalent would be boarding up someone's house so they can't escape. I agree with everyone. Military doesn't serve the right purpose here. I think an escalation of violence just leads to more strife and insurrection, that kind of thing. I think there's many other levers we can use to influence behavior. Incentives, rewards, taxes, various things. But on the other point, I think we all hope that we're going to get to herd immunity. And that is when people get vaccinated and they do the right thing and we kill this virus. And there's pockets in the US where, they're returning to life and normal and there's, gathering without masks. And so, one lever, I guess we would say, is we won't take our tourist dollars to those destinations. We'll stay home in Canada where it's safe. And maybe we won't allow people from those areas to enter Canada. But that's a very blunt instrument. So I think, in the US, they might have to do something that's a little bit more, I don't know if the military is the right solution there, but I think we're at risk of having this virus continue to mutate and never getting it under control if we continue to sort of have, celebrities encouraging people to tear masks off others and make fun of people who are wearing them. So it's a complicated situation.
It is, absolutely. Well, and maybe soon that our sponsors will want to get in here and do some advertising. Actually, there aren't any. But let's do one more question and then I'll sum up our meeting today. I think this might be the most important one and the long-lasting one. Considering that scientists and health professionals have been warning about pandemics for decades, what action should be taken now in anticipation of the next pandemic? How should we have been prepared for the present crisis? We'll go to Hal first.
Thanks, Ron. That is a great question. I think the one advantage we have now is that a real pandemic did happen, and the scars are fresh. So I think there is an appetite for an improved mechanism, a global mechanism for dealing with such things. So I think that's we have to harvest that, and we have to do a full workup on what worked and what did not work this time. And from there, take those lessons and invest in the infrastructure to apply them when the next one comes along.
Okay, good points. Raylene.
I think there is evidence that we've learned from previous situations. I think the Toronto hospitals that dealt with SARS in 2003 put measures into place to say, we need to act quickly, we need to have rapid testing, we need to enforce some of our protocols. So I believe what we have experienced in the past has informed us for today. I don't think anyone anticipated a pandemic to this degree. And I agree how, we're living it globally. So everyone will be saying, oh, okay, we've been through this before. We need to wear masks or we need to get those tests out quickly. So I think we can't help but learn from this. And one thing I'm really encouraged by is, operating in the healthcare space, I see so many people sharing information. There's webinars, conferences, tutorials, lessons. People are really soaking up all the information they can. Healthcare leaders, it's in their DNA to learn and to, learn from mistakes and to adapt and adjust. So I am feeling optimistic in how our scientists have come together, how we've really communicated across countries, across organizations. We're breaking down some silos. And I think, we're all just a little bit more aware too of how our economies are intrinsically linked, how our supply chain works. So we have really matured, I think, as a global organization to really understand many of these concepts that would have been, oh, that's economics, I don't want to deal with that, or that's science. We're all having a really strong education, and we're going to hold people to account to make sure that they do learn from their mistakes and be better for it in next time.
Thank you, Raylyn. Brent, your thoughts on this topic?
It's a hard one to answer with hindsight, obviously, because you have all this hindsight now. So what shoulda, coulda, woulda, it really becomes a difficult conversation when you're in the middle of it. As far as better preparedness, the one thing that comes to mind, and you actually had this as one of the possible discussion topics that we had on for the evening, and it's a tricky one in itself, but I really do think that the concept of universal basic income actually is a means by which it would lend itself to the most common form of spread, which is people going to work because they need to have that money and they don't have paid sick time because they have no other form of guaranteed income that's easy to apply for. Whereas if there was a UBI platform in place, I think that it would create a means by which people wouldn't necessarily feel the need to go to the places which really are the ones that are creating the spread and really have been the source of the second, the third wave, and for the reason for all of the other things that we've sacrificed is people got to go to work because we don't necessarily have alternative means to supply the income. And we haven't addressed it. And I think that is probably the one biggest thing from a prevention standpoint that could have a meaningful impact. The next pandemic, it might not be old people, the elder population that gets hit the hardest. So you can't just say, oh, do a much better job with nursing homes, right? We don't know what the next pandemic would bring, but what I do know is if people did have something as a fallback, they wouldn't feel as required to go into work and spread it at whatever factory or plant or building that they feel that they have to congregate in, even when they are sick.
Thank you, Brent. I certainly agree with you in that the question is, do we learn from the past? And I think the real problem is between generations. Do we learn from previous generations? Because in my research, looking at the Spanish flu, which was not really started in Spain, it was started in Japan. If you look at what happened during that period, almost identical to what we're trying to do today. So in essence, there was a plan in our history that could deal with all these questions that we've been trying to figure out. Stephanie, you get the last shot this evening.
Thanks, Ron. I agree with everyone across the board. You guys said it really well. I'll just add on that we're also learning a few long-term negative effects on our mental and physical health from being in the lockdown, and also economic effects. Sometimes this stuff isn't talked about too much, and hopefully we'll have a better plan to handle these negative effects. And also it's not so much, in some cases, we're not going to be better prepared. Maybe our way of living will just change. One example of this is small businesses that were not online, didn't have a social media platform, didn't have online sales. They struggled a lot. And after the first, second, third lockdown, a lot of them didn't come through. So it's definitely impacted the way we live.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think just before we leave this particular question, for me, another big question that we're not going to take time to delve into in depth. My wife and I have been helping our 5 grandchildren with their at-home learning on their computers. And I think the big question for all of us that have parents or have children or grandchildren is the mental effect it's going to have on our children from online learning. Having sat with my grandkids, they're not getting the content they normally would. It's much harder to concentrate. So as a secondary plan, yes, but we need to get them back to school as soon as possible, in my opinion. Before I wrap up for the evening, do any of my panelists wish to make any final comments on any aspect of our meeting tonight? Okay, I would like to thank each of our panelists tonight for their enthusiastic and knowledgeable participation. The main reason I believe in podcasts like this and the purpose of my Ron Hesketh Open Dialogue website is to engage more people in conversations. It's really easy to complain about things. It's a lot harder to get together with your peers and people in power and talk about possible solutions. And I think we'd all agree that in a pandemic, we need everybody's input. Nobody has the secret answer to solving these tremendously huge questions. So the purpose of this podcast and continuing ones are to open up that dialogue, encourage us all to speak out and say what we think. I'd like to thank our regular prescribers rather, that will be watching this, and any guests that showed up tonight. The next podcast in this series of 6 will be on the same topic, but from a much different angle. I have lined up health professionals, analysts, and yes, a politician to discuss the aspects of COVID-19. Good night, everyone. And please visit my website as displayed on the screen. And I welcome anybody's input by email, phone call, pigeon, whatever you want to do. Thank you and good night.